The water rippled in slow motion. Bubbles rose through the murky blue, catching fragments of harsh summer sunlight as they ascended. A pair of worn sneakers caked with Iowa mud and fraying at the seams sank deeper into the chlorinated depths. Above, distorted by the wavering surface, faces peered down, their laughter muffled by the water. A girl's scream, sharp, then suddenly silenced, hung in the air like an echo searching for release. Sometimes the quietest souls carry the most dangerous secrets. In 1987, in the forgotten corner of America's heartland, a silent farm girl was about to teach an entire town what real strength looked like. Sarah Harper woke before the sun, as she did every morning. The old farmhouse creaked with familiar complaints as her bare feet navigated the worn floorboards of the upstairs hallway. At 16, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been shouldering adult responsibilities for years. Her wheat blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that carried both youth and a weariness beyond her years. Eyes the color of a winter ski, pale blue, watchful and guarded, scanned the darkened kitchen as she entered. The farm kitchen was a time capsule. Wallpaper from the 1970s, yellowed at the edges, depicted faded cornflowers. A hefty refrigerator hummed loudly, its white surface bearing the scars of decades of use. On the kitchen table sat a transistor radio perpetually tuned to the local station that alternated between weather reports, grain prices, and Bruce Springsteen's latest hits. This was Riverdale, Iowa, population 5274, according to the peeling green sign at the town limits. A place where most folks still left their doors unlocked at night, where church on Sunday wasn't optional, and where 3 generations of the same family often shared Sunday dinner. The world was changing rapidly beyond its borders, but Riverdale held on to its ways with the same stubborn grip with which it clung to its traditional values. Sarah moved to the back door, slipping her feet into mud-caked boots that waited there. They were men's boots, too large for her, stuffed with newspaper, at the toes her father's old pair. Pulling a worn flannel shirt over her t-shirt, she stepped out into the pre-dawn air, her breath forming small clouds in the early autumn chill. The Harper farm spread out before her, 80 acres of corn, a modest operation by Iowa standards, but it had been in the family for 3 generations. The red barn, once bright, but now weathered to the color of old brick, stood as a sentinel against the lightning sky. Behind it, a silo reached upward, and beyond that, cornfields stretched toward the horizon, the stalks rustling with the whispered promises of harvest. The sound of lowing cattle greeted her as she approached the barn, its massive door groaning as she pushed it open. Inside, the familiar sense of hay manure and decades of use enveloped her. 5 dairy cows turned their heads in lazy acknowledgement of her arrival. "Morning, ladies," Sarah murmured, her voice soft in the cavernous space. The ritual began: feed the animals, check their water muck out stalls. Work that demanded her full attention, keeping thoughts at bay that would otherwise crowd her mind. As she forked hay into the feeding trough, her muscles moved with practiced ease, hardened by years of farm labor. She was nearly finished when she heard the approaching footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Her father, William Harper, stood in the barn doorway, his silhouette outlined by the rising sun behind him. At 48, he was still a powerful man, though years of physical labor had begun to stoop his shoulders. His face, weathered like the land he worked, revealed little, but his eyes, the same pale blue as Sarah's, carried the weight of a man who had seen too much loss. "School day," he said simply, his voice a graveled rumble from years of smoking Marlboros. Sarah nodded. Words were precious commodities in the Harper household, not to be wasted on unnecessary conversation. "Michael up?" she asked, referring to her 14-year-old brother. William's face tightened slightly, the closest thing to an expression he typically offered. "Not yet." Sarah set down her pitchfork. "I'll get him." The house was still quiet when she returned, the silence broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, her mother's pride, one of the few items that had survived from better days. Sarah climbed the stairs, passing the closed door of her father's bedroom before stopping at her brother's. She knocked once, then entered without waiting for a response. Michael Harper lay sprawled across his bed, blankets twisted around his lanky frame, his dark hair a stark contrast to his sister's blonde. His walls were plastered with posters of athletes and rock bands: Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Bon Jovi, Guns N' Roses. A desperate attempt to connect with a world beyond Riverdale. "Mike," Sarah said, giving his shoulder a gentle shake. "Time for school." Michael groaned, burying his face deeper into his pillow. 5 more minutes. "Dad's already up." The magic words. Michael's eyes snapped open, suddenly alert. William Harper's tolerance for tardiness was non-existent, a lesson both children had learned early and painfully. "I'm up," he mumbled, pushing himself upright. Sarah left him to dress, heading to the bathroom they shared. The mirror above the sink revealed what she already knew, a girl who looked older than 16 with calloused hands and shadows beneath her eyes. Her mother's eyes, everyone said, though Sarah had begun to forget the details of Elizabeth Harper's face. 10 years. 10 years since her mother had been found in the barn hanging from a rafter, her delicate feet swinging above the hay-strewn floor. Sarah had been 6, Michael only 4. Too young to understand, but old enough to feel the seismic shift in their world. The official story was depression, a chemical imbalance, the doctor had called it. But whispers traveled through Riverdale like wind through cornfields. Whispers about a woman who couldn't handle farm life, who'd been too fragile, too refined for the harshness of rural existence. Some even suggested she'd been unfaithful, that the shame had driven her to take her own life. Sarah splashed cold water on her face, pushing away the memories. There was no time for dwelling on the past, not when the present demanded so much. Breakfast was simple: eggs from their own chickens, toast. Coffee for her father, milk for Michael, and orange juice for Sarah. They ate in silence, the clink of forks against plates the only conversation. The kitchen wall held a calendar from the local feed store, President Reagan's face smiling benevolently from the top. The date, September 15, 1987, circled in red. Harvest season would begin soon, demanding even more from all of them. As they ate, the radio droned on about the farm crisis gripping the Midwest. Foreclosures, bankruptcies, farmers losing land that had been in families for generations. The Harpers had survived so far, but barely. Each month was a tightrope walk over financial ruin. "Bus in 10 minutes, William announced, folding his newspaper 2 days old, borrowed from a neighbor. He rose, placing his dishes in the sink with mechanical precision, then headed outside without another word. The screen door slammed behind him, a period at the end of a terse sentence. Michael gulped down the last of his milk. "Sarah, can you drive me to Jason's after school? The team's hanging out." Sarah glanced at him, noting the hopeful gleam in his eyes. Michael played junior varsity basketball, his ticket to social acceptance at Riverdale High. Unlike his sister, who moved through the school hallways like a ghost, Michael desperately wanted to belong. "I've got chores," she replied, gathering their plates. "Please," his voice cracked, hovering between boyhood and the man he was becoming. "I'll do your evening feeding." Sarah hesitated. She knew what those gatherings were like, boys showing off, talking about girls, the seeds of the men they would become taking root. Men like those who had spread rumors about their mother. But Michael's eyes pleaded with her. "I'll ask Dad," she finally said. Relief washed over his face. "Thanks, Sarah." They finished getting ready in the efficient choreography of siblings who've shared space for years. Michael grabbed his backpack, knew this shire, a rare concession from their father to his growing son's pleas to fit in. Sarah's bag was 3 years old, the canvas fraying at the corners, patched with careful stitches. As they stepped onto the porch, the yellow school bus appeared at the end of their long gravel driveway, dust billowing behind it like a dirty comet tail. The Harper farm sat 2 miles from town, isolated enough that neighbors weren't visible from the house, just the way William preferred it. The bus arrived with a squeal of brakes, its door folding open to reveal Mr. Gunderson, the same driver who'd been shuttling Riverdale's children for 20 years. His weathered face creased into a smile at the sight of the Harper kids. "Morning, Sarah, Michael." They climbed aboard Michael, immediately heading toward the back where the athletes gathered. Sarah took her usual seat near the front, alone, her back straight, eyes forward. As the bus pulled away, she caught a glimpse of her father standing by the barn, watching them leave, a solitary figure against the vast Iowa sky. Riverdale High School stood at the edge of town, a 2-story brick building that had educated the town's children since the 1950s. American flags flanked the entrance, and a marquee announced the upcoming football game against neighboring Springfield. Inside, the hallways gleamed with freshly polished floors. Lockers painted in the school colors of blue and gold lined the walls, and the trophy case near the main office displayed the modest victories of a small-town school. Sarah moved through the morning crowd like water flowing around rocks, neither seen nor heard. Her locker was at the end of the main hallway, as far from the popular crowd as possible. She spun the combination lock with practiced fingers, exchanging books with methodical precision. The first warning bell rang, sending students scurrying. Sarah closed her locker and turned only to find herself face to face with Heather Wilson. Heather was everything Sarah was not: confident, stylish, vocal. Her auburn hair was teased into the latest style, held in place with enough hairspray to endanger the ozone layer. Her clothes were new and fashionable: acid-wash jeans, an oversized sweater, and pristine white keds. As the daughter of Mayor Wilson, Heather stood at the pinnacle of Riverdale High's social hierarchy. She wasn't alone. Flanking her were Brad Simmons and Jason Mercer, both seniors, both on the varsity football team. Behind them, a cluster of cheerleaders watched with anticipation, like an audience awaiting a show. "Well, if it isn't Farmer Sarah," Heather said, her voice carrying down the hallway, "I think you brought some of your cow friends' perfume to school with you." Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd. Sarah remained silent, her face a carefully constructed mask. She had perfected the art of invisibility: eyes down, shoulders hunched. Nothing to attract attention or provoke further torment. "What's wrong? Farm girl cat got your tongue." Brad chimed in, his varsity jacket stretched across broad shoulders, a championship ring glinting on his finger. Sarah attempted to step around them, but Jason shifted, blocking her path. At 6'2", he towered over her 5'5" frame. "We're talking to you," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "It's rude not to answer." More laughter, more eyes watching. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained impassive. She'd endured this for years: the taunts, the accidental shoves, the whispers that followed her through the hallways. Daughter of the crazy woman. The farm freak. "She thinks she's too good for us," Heather stage whispered to her friends. "Little Miss Perfect with her straight A's and her holier-than-thou attitude." The final bell rang, offering salvation. A teacher emerged from a nearby classroom, frowning at the lingering students. "Get to class, all of you," he called. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, Heather shooting Sarah a last venomous glare before sauntering away, her court following faithfully behind her. Sarah exhaled slowly, unclenching the fists she hadn't realized she'd formed, and headed to her first class. What none of them knew, what no one in Riverdale could possibly suspect, was that beneath Sarah Harper's silent exterior lay a secret that would have shocked them all. A secret that had been forged in the old barn behind the Harper farmhouse, under the watchful eye of the one person who had seen something in Sarah that everyone else had missed. The memories came to her during American history as Mr. Peterson droned on about the Cold War. Sarah stared out the window at the football field, her mind drifting back 6 years to the summer she turned 10. That was when Uncle James arrived. James Harper wasn't actually her uncle, he was William's cousin, but the title of uncle had been bestowed upon him by a much younger Sarah. He appeared one sweltering July afternoon in a battered Jeep Wrangler dust, swirling around him like a desert mirage. Even at 10, Sarah had recognized something different about him, something dangerous. James stood 6 feet tall, his body lean and hard as hickory. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down to his arm, a stark white line against his tan skin. His eyes were the Harper blue, but unlike William's, which revealed nothing, James's eyes saw everything. "Military," her father had explained curtly when she asked about the scar later that night. "Navy SEAL, he served in the Gulf." That was all the information William offered, but it was enough to ignite Sarah's imagination. She'd seen movies about soldiers, about heroes. Was her uncle a hero too? James stayed in the old hunting cabin at the edge of the property. William had been reluctant to have him there at all, but blood was blood in Riverdale, and turning away family wasn't done. The two men circled each other warily, some old tension crackling between them that Sarah couldn't understand. It was 3 days after James's arrival when Sarah found him in the barn, moving through a series of precise, fluid movements that looked like a strange dance. His eyes were closed, his breathing controlled, his body flowing from one position to another with predatory grace. She must have made a sound because James's eyes snapped open, fixing on her with laser intensity. For a moment he looked dangerous, truly dangerous, and then his face softened. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but carrying an underlying strength. "Come in." She hesitated at the barn door, suddenly shy. "What were you doing?" she asked. James considered her for a long moment, as if making a decision. "Training," he finally said. "For what?" A smile touched the corner of his mouth, making his scar twist slightly. "For life, little one. For surviving it." Sarah took a step closer, curiosity overcoming caution. Can you teach me? The question seemed to surprise him. He studied her with those penetrating eyes looking past her small frame and quiet demeanor to something else, something even Sarah didn't know was there. Why do you want to learn? Sarah thought about the emptiness in the house since her mother's death, about her father's silence, about the whispers at school and the way other children avoided her as if tragedy might be contagious. I'm tired of being scared, she said simply. Something flickered in James's eyes, recognition perhaps, or respect. He nodded once decisively. First lesson, he said, awareness. Always know what's around you. That was the beginning. Every day that summer, Sarah slipped away to the barn for an hour, sometimes two. James taught her the basics of Krav Maga, not as a sport, but as what it was designed to be, a survival system. He showed her how to stand, how to breathe, how to fall without getting hurt. As her small body grew stronger, he taught her how to strike, where to hit to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. You're small, he told her. You'll always be smaller than most opponents. So you have to be smarter, faster, more precise. When school started in the fall, the lessons continued in the evenings and on weekends. James never raised his voice, never showed impatience with her slow progress. He simply corrected, demonstrated, and made her practice again and again until the movements became instinct. What you're learning isn't for showing off, he warned her. It's not for bullies at school or to impress your friends. This is for life or death. Remember that. Sarah did remember. She kept the lessons secret, instinctively understanding that her father wouldn't approve. William Harper believed in keeping one's head down and not making waves. Violence, even in self-defense, would have appalled him. The lessons continued for a year before William discovered them. He came upon them in the barn one autumn afternoon, Sarah executing a perfect throw that sent James, a man 3 times her weight, crashing to the hay-strewn floor. William's face had turned a dangerous shade of red. What the hell is this? James got to his feet, calmly brushing hay from his clothes. I'm teaching Sarah to protect herself. She's 11 years old. Old enough to learn what the world is really like. The two men faced each other, decades of unspoken resentment crackling between them. Sarah stood frozen, suddenly afraid in a way she hadn't been since the lessons began. She's my daughter, William said, his voice low and dangerous. Not yours to turn into, whatever you are. James didn't flinch. And what are you turning her into, Billy? A ghost like her mother? The words struck like physical blows. William took a step forward, fists clenched, but James stood his ground, unafraid. Get out, William said through clenched teeth. Today, and don't come back. James looked at Sarah, something like regret in his eyes. Remember what I taught you, little one. The world will try to break you. Don't let it. He was gone by nightfall, the old Jeep kicking up dust as it disappeared down the long driveway. Sarah watched from her bedroom window, tears streaming silently down her face. That night, her father came to her room, a rare occurrence. He sat on the edge of her bed, his weight making the old springs creak in protest. What James was teaching you, it's not for girls like you, he said, awkwardly. It's violent, dangerous. Sarah looked up at him, suddenly angry. Mom was gentle, kind. Did that save her? William flinched as if she'd struck him. For a moment, raw pain flashed across his face, so intense that Sarah was frightened by it. Then the mask descended again, leaving his features impassive. We don't speak of that, he said, rising from the bed, ever. He left, closing the door firmly behind him, ending the conversation and seemingly the chapter of James in their lives. But Sarah didn't stop. In the privacy of the old barn, in the hidden corners of their property, she continued to practice what James had taught her. Each movement, each stance became a connection to the only person who had seen strength in her when everyone else saw only a silent, broken girl. For 5 years she practiced in secret, and no one, not her father, not Michael, not the tormentors at school, had any idea of what the quiet farm girl was capable of. The school day dragged on, each class bleeding into the next. Sarah moved through them with quiet competence, earning top grades without drawing attention to herself. It was a delicate balance, being smart enough to excel, but invisible enough to avoid notice. At lunch, she sat alone at the far end of a table near the cafeteria exit, eating the sandwich she'd packed that morning. The cafeteria buzzed with the controlled chaos of adolescence, shouted conversations, bursts of laughter, the occasional food items sailing through the air when teachers weren't looking. From her isolated position, Sarah observed the social ecosystem of Riverdale High with anthropological detachment. The jocks clustered around tables near the center, Heather and her cheerleaders holding court nearby. The band kids gathered near the windows sharing sheet music and inside jokes. The stoners slouched at tables near the back doors for quick escapes to smoke behind the gym. And then there were the invisibles, like her, the handful of students who existed in the margins, neither bullied nor accepted, simply overlooked. Sarah had made peace with her place in the hierarchy. Invisibility was safer than attention. Her solitude was interrupted when Michael appeared beside her table fidgeting nervously. Behind him stood a boy Sarah recognized as a sophomore on the JV basketball team, Ryan something. Sarah, Michael said, his voice low, eyes darting around to make sure none of his friends were watching. Heather Wilson's having a pool party Saturday. The whole team's invited. Sarah continued eating her sandwich, waiting for the point. I need a ride, Michael continued. Dad's got the truck for deliveries on Saturday. Take the bus, Sarah suggested quietly. Michael's face flushed. The bus to Heather Wilson's house, I might as well wear a sign that says, poor farm kid. Sarah sighed. The Wilson estate sat on the outskirts of town in the opposite direction from the Harper farm, the good side of Riverdale where the houses had names instead of addresses, and the lawns were maintained by professional services rather than family sweat. I've got chores, Mike. Please, Sarah, this is important. The desperation in his voice was palpable. It's my chance to really be part of the team. Brad and Jason will be there. Coach might even stop by. Sarah looked at her brother, really looked at him. At 14, Michael was all sharp angles and uncertain movements caught in the awkward transition from boy to man. His dark hair, inherited from their mother's side, flopped over eyes that held a hunger for acceptance Sarah had never felt. He wanted so badly to fit in, to be someone other than that Harper boy from the farm. I'll figure something out, she finally said. Michael's face lit up with relief. Thanks, Sarah. Saturday at 4. I promise I'll do your chores all week. He hurried away with his friend, already distancing himself from his sister in the public sphere of the cafeteria. Sarah watched him go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. Michael was slipping away from her, from the farm, from the quiet life they'd known. Part of her wanted to pull him back to protect him from disappointment. Another part envied his desperate desire to belong. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Sarah gathered her things, disposed of her trash, and headed toward her next class. As she navigated the crowded hallway, a shoulder slammed into hers, sending her stumbling against the lockers. Jason Mercer smirked down at her. Watch where you're going, farm girl, he said loudly enough for others to hear. Sarah said nothing, regaining her balance and continuing on her way. Inside, however, something shifted. A subtle change in her breathing, a slight adjustment in her stance, automatic responses ingrained by years of training. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have noticed the momentary transformation, the way her eyes tracked Jason's movements, calculating distance and angle, the way her hands briefly formed loose fists before relaxing. But no one was watching closely. No one ever did. After school, Sarah headed to the library instead of taking the bus home. She had told her father she needed to research a history project, and while that wasn't entirely untrue, her real purpose was more personal. Riverdale's public library was a small brick building on Main Street, its interior cool and quiet, smelling of old paper and furniture polish. Mrs. Abernathy, the librarian, since time immemorial, nodded to Sarah as she entered. The two had an unspoken understanding. Sarah was one of the few teenagers who treated the library with appropriate reverence, and in return, Mrs. Abernathy allowed her access to areas usually restricted to adults. History section, Mrs. Abernathy asked. Sarah shook her head. Newspaper archives, please. If the librarian found this request unusual, she didn't show it. She simply led Sarah to a back room where bound volumes of the Riverdale Gazette were stored chronologically, along with a microfiche machine for more recent editions. Anything in particular you're looking for? Sarah hesitated. Information about the military operations in Panama, 1989. Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly. That's fairly recent history, dear. It's for a project on modern military interventions, Sarah lied smoothly. The librarian seemed satisfied with this explanation. You'll want the microfiche then. I believe we have all the major newspaper coverage. The Times Post, even some international perspectives. She showed Sarah how to operate the machine, then left her alone with the archived materials. Sarah waited until the door closed before beginning her real search. The date was etched into her memory, July 17th, 1977, 10 years and 2 months ago. The day her mother died. The local paper was weekly then, and it took Sarah some time to find the relevant edition. When she did, her heart stuttered. There on page 3 was a small headline, "Local woman dies in apparent suicide." The article was brief, clinical. Elizabeth Harper, 34, found in family barn by husband. Survived by husband, William, daughter Sarah, 6, and son Michael, 4. No suspicious circumstances. Funeral services, private. Sarah read it 3 times, searching for clues for anything that might contradict the official story. There was nothing. Just a few cold sentences summarizing the end of a life. She moved on to the next edition and the next, looking for follow-up stories. Nothing. It was as if her mother had slipped beneath the surface of Riverdale's consciousness without leaving a ripple. Frustrated, Sarah turned to the archives from 6 months earlier. If she couldn't find answers about her mother's death, perhaps she could learn more about her life. The search was tedious, but Sarah was nothing if not patient. She skimmed through community announcements, school board meetings, agricultural reports. And then in a January edition, she found a photograph that made her blood freeze. It was a charity event at the mayor's mansion, a fundraiser for the new hospital wing. The photograph showed a group of well-dressed couples smiling for the camera. And there, standing side by side, were Elizabeth Harper and Dr. Wilson, now Mayor Wilson Heather's father. The caption read, "Dr. Richard Wilson welcomes former military nurse Elizabeth Harper to the hospital staff. Mrs. Harper served with distinction in the Panama conflict." Sarah stared at the image, unable to look away. Her mother, her gentle, quiet mother, whom she barely remembered, had been a military nurse, and she had known Mayor Wilson before he was mayor. The photograph revealed other details Sarah had forgotten or never known. Her mother had been beautiful, not in the showy way of Heather and her friends, but with a serene dignity. Her dark hair was pulled back from a face that held both strength and kindness. She stood slightly apart from Dr. Wilson, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Sarah carefully copied the article and photo reference numbers, then continued her search with renewed purpose. She found 3 more mentions of her mother, all related to the hospital, all mentioning her military background, all connecting her to Dr. Wilson's department. The last article was dated 3 months before her death. As Sarah prepared to leave, replacing the archives carefully, a new question formed in her mind. If her mother and Mayor Wilson had worked together, might he know something about her death that no one had told her? The thought was still with her as she left the library, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across Main Street. Riverdale was quiet at this hour, shops preparing to close, the dinner rush not yet begun. Sarah walked slowly, her mind churning with questions. She was so distracted that she almost missed the black sedan parked across from the library, its engine idling. Almost missed the man watching her from behind the wheel, a man she recognized as one of Mayor Wilson's security detail. Sarah kept walking, her pace steady, but her senses suddenly heightened. James's first lesson echoed in her mind. Awareness. Always know what's around you. The car pulled away from the curb, following her at a distance. Sarah didn't look back, didn't give any indication that she'd noticed. Instead, she took a deliberate wrong turn, heading away from the bus stop toward the more crowded area near the town square. The car continued to follow. Sarah's heart rate increased, but her breathing remained controlled. She cut through the park where vehicles couldn't follow, emerging on the other side near the diner, where many of Riverdale's farmers gathered for afternoon coffee. The black sedan was waiting. This was no coincidence. Sarah walked directly to the diner, pushing through the door with a confidence she didn't feel. Inside, the place was half full, mostly with men, her father's age, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and the scent of coffee. Old Mr. Jenkins, who owned the farm neighboring the Harpers, looked up in surprise. "Sarah, everything all right, girl?" Sarah managed to smile. "Fine, Mr. Jenkins. Just wondering if I could use your phone to call my dad for a ride. I missed the bus." "Course you can. Phone's in the back." Sarah thanked him and headed toward the rear of the diner, feeling safer among these men who had known her since birth. Through the window, she saw the black sedan drive away. In the small hallway near the restrooms, Sarah found the payphone. She deposited a quarter and dialed the Harper Farms number, listening to it ring 4 times before her father's gruff voice answered. "Dad, it's me, and I'm at Jenkins' diner. Can you come get me? A pause. Something wrong with the bus? Sarah hesitated. Should she tell him about what she'd found at the library? Something held her back, the memory of his face when she'd mentioned her mother, the wall that always went up between them at the slightest reference to Elizabeth. I lost track of time at the library, she said instead. Research project. Another pause. Be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Sarah hung up the receiver, leaning against the wall, as tension drained from her body. Whatever had just happened, whatever it meant, she would have time to think about it later. For now, she was safe. She returned to the main area of the diner, smiling gratefully at Mr. Jenkins. He's coming. Thanks for letting me use the phone. No trouble. Sit down. Have some pie while you wait. On the house. Sarah accepted the offer, sliding into a booth near the window, where she could watch the street. The apple pie arrived warm with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, melting on top, simple, familiar comfort food. As she ate, Sarah considered what she'd learned. Her mother had been a military nurse who served in Panama. She had worked with Dr. Wilson at the local hospital. And now, a decade after her death, someone connected to Mayor Wilson was following her daughter. None of it made sense. And yet Sarah felt a strange certainty that these pieces were connected, that somewhere in this puzzle lay the truth about her mother's death. 20 minutes later, the Harper pickup truck pulled up outside the diner, her father visible behind the wheel. Sarah thanked Mr. Jenkins again and hurried out, climbing into the passenger seat. William Harper glanced at his daughter, his face revealing nothing. Your brother's doing your chores, he said, pulling away from the curb. You'll do his tomorrow to make up for it. Yes, sir. They drove in silence through town, passing the library, the courthouse, the row of small businesses that constituted Riverdale's commercial district. As they turned onto the highway that would take them back to the farm, Sarah gathered her courage. Dad, she began carefully, did Mom work at the hospital with Dr. Wilson before she died? The truck swerved slightly before William corrected its course. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Where did you hear that? His voice was dangerously quiet. I saw an old newspaper article at the library. It said she was a military nurse in Panama. William was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. That was a long time ago, before you were born. But she worked with him with Mayor Wilson. It doesn't matter now, Sarah persisted, driven by a need to understand. Did they know each other well? Were they friends? The truck suddenly pulled onto the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as it came to an abrupt stop. William turned to face his daughter, his expression more animated than she had seen in years with anger. Listen to me, Sarah. The past is gone. Your mother is gone. Digging around in old newspapers won't bring her back. All it will do is stir up trouble. Is that what you want? More trouble for this family? Sarah shrank back against the door, startled by the intensity of his reaction. No, sir. Then drop it. Focus on school, on the farm, on your future. Not the past, never the past. His voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing a glimpse of the pain he carried beneath his stoic exterior. They sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant call of birds in the fields beside the road. Finally, William shifted the truck back into drive and pulled onto the highway. Neither spoke for the remainder of the journey home, but Sarah's mind was working furiously. Her father's reaction had told her more than any newspaper article could. There was something about her mother's relationship with Dr. Wilson, something important enough to provoke fear in a man who feared nothing. And Sarah was now more determined than ever to discover what it was. The old barn stood silhouetted against the evening sky, its weathered silhouette a constant in Sarah's life. After dinner, another silent affair broken only by Michael's tentative questions about the upcoming basketball season, Sarah slipped away to this sanctuary. Inside the barn was cool and dim, illuminated only by the last rays of sunlight filtering through gaps in the wooden walls. The familiar sense of hay animal feed and decades of use enveloped her like an old blanket. This was where she felt most at peace and most alive. Sarah climbed the ladder to the hayloft, moving with practiced ease in the near darkness. In the far corner, concealed beneath old feed sacks and a tarp, was a wooden chest that had once belonged to her grandfather. Sarah had claimed it years ago with her father's indifferent permission. She pulled away the covering, revealing the battered trunk beneath. The lock was simple, the key hidden in a crack in the floorboard nearby. Sarah retrieved it and opened the chest, revealing her most precious possessions. On top lay a faded photograph in a simple frame, the only picture of her mother she had managed to save from her father's purge after the funeral. Elizabeth Harper smiled at the camera, her dark hair blowing in a summer breeze, her arms wrapped around a 6-year-old Sarah. They were standing in a field of wildflowers, their expressions mirroring each other's joy. Sarah set the photograph aside carefully, then removed several books gifts from James during that formative summer. Beneath these lay what she had come for, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with notes, diagrams, and observations, Sarah's record of everything James had taught her. She opened it to a blank page and began to write, documenting her discoveries at the library and her father's reaction. The act of writing clarified her thoughts, helped her see connections she might otherwise have missed. When she finished, Sarah closed the journal and returned it to the chest. But as she prepared to replace the other items, she noticed something strange, the corner of an unfamiliar envelope protruding from beneath the chest's lining. Curious, Sarah tugged at it gently. The lining, dry and brittle with age, came away easily, revealing a sealed envelope that had been hidden beneath it. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting on the front faded but still legible. For Sarah when she's ready, E.H. E.H. Elizabeth Harper. Her mother's handwriting. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the envelope. How long had it been here? Had her mother hidden it somehow, knowing she wouldn't be around to give it to her daughter personally? Or had someone else placed it here, someone who knew Sarah used this chest? Questions swirled in her mind, but one certainty remained: this was meant for her. With careful fingers, Sarah broke the seal and removed the contents, several folded pages, and a small key unlike any she had seen before. The first page was a letter dated just 2 weeks before her mother's death. My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you, and for that I am so deeply sorry. There is so much I wanted to teach you, to show you, to tell you as you grew. So many moments I will miss. But there are things you need to know, truths that may be difficult to hear, but necessary for your safety and understanding. I've tried to protect you and Michael from this burden, but I fear that isn't possible anymore. During my service as a nurse in Panama, I witnessed something I should not have seen. Richard Wilson, who now presents himself as Riverdale's most upstanding citizen, was conducting unauthorized medical experiments on soldiers under the guise of treating combat stress. I discovered his program by accident and gathered evidence of his actions, intending to report him to the proper authorities. But Wilson has powerful friends, people who helped him bury his crimes and return to civilian life with his reputation intact. When I threatened to expose him, despite their protection, the threats began. Not against me, but against you and Michael. Your father knows some of this, but not all. I've kept much from him to protect him too. William is a good man, but he believes in a world that makes sense, that follows rules. He cannot comprehend the kind of evil that would harm children to protect a reputation. The key enclosed opens a safe deposit box at Riverdale Savings and Loan. Inside is all the evidence I gathered, enough to destroy Wilson if it ever came to light. I've arranged for duplicate records to be held by a trusted friend, with instructions to release everything if anything suspicious happens to me or my family. This is my insurance policy for you, Sarah. My way of protecting you even if I'm gone. You are stronger than you know, my sweet girl. You have my determination and your father's resilience. Whatever happens, remember that I love you always and completely. Your loving mother, Elizabeth. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the barn. Her mother hadn't committed suicide. She had been threatened, possibly killed, to protect Mayor Wilson's secrets. The other pages contained notes, dates, and names, details of what Elizabeth had witnessed in Panama. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what was described: experimental drugs administered without consent, treatments that left soldiers with permanent psychological damage, deaths classified as combat-related that were anything but, and Richard Wilson's signature on every authorization form. Sarah sat back against the rough wooden wall of the hayloft, her mind struggling to process this revelation. Her mother, her gentle, kind mother, had been a whistleblower, a woman of principle, willing to stand against powerful men. And she might have paid for that courage with her life. The sound of the barn door opening below startled Sarah from her thoughts. She quickly returned the letter and key to the envelope, slipping it into her pocket as she heard her father's voice. Sarah, you up there? Yes, Dad, just a minute. She hastily replaced the other items in the chest, locked it, and covered it with the tarp before descending the ladder. William Harper stood at the bottom, his face partially shadowed in the dim light. It's getting late, he said. School tomorrow. Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral, despite the thundering of her heart. Did he know about the letter? Had he hidden it there himself, or was it truly her mother's secret preserved all these years? I'm coming, she said. As they walked back to the house together, Sarah was acutely aware of the envelope in her pocket, of the weight of the truth it contained. For the first time in her life, she looked at her father and wondered how much he really knew about her mother's death, whether his silence all these years had been grief or guilt. One thing was certain: Sarah Harper was no longer just a quiet farm girl with a secret talent for self-defense. She was now the keeper of a far more dangerous secret, one that powerful people in Riverdale would kill to protect. And as she entered the house, hearing Michael's laughter from the living room where he watched TV, Sarah made a silent promise to her mother. She would find the truth no matter where it led, no matter who stood in her way. The quiet farm girl had found her purpose, and Riverdale would never be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Harper farm as Sarah stood at the edge of the cornfield, her breath visible in the autumn air. Sleep had eluded her after the discovery of her mother's letter, her mind churning with questions that had no answers. Now as dawn broke over the Iowa landscape, she felt the weight of her mother's words like a physical burden. The letter was hidden in her sock drawer, the small key taped beneath her bedside table. All night she had wrestled with what to do next. Go to the bank. Tell her father, confront Mayor Wilson directly. Each option carried risks she couldn't fully calculate. The sound of the screen door slamming pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Michael bounded down the porch steps, basketball tucked under his arm, his face alight with teenage enthusiasm. Dad says I can go to Heather's party if I finish my chores early, he called, jogging toward her. And he says you can take Uncle James's Chevy if you're careful. Sarah's stomach tightened. The party. With everything that had happened, she had almost forgotten Michael's plea for a ride to the Wilson estate. Now the prospect of entering the mayor's property carried new and dangerous implications. Did you ask him about the car? She asked, forcing her voice to remain neutral. Michael nodded. He called Uncle James this morning, said it was time you learned to drive something better than the old tractor. He spun the basketball on his finger, a trick he'd been practicing for weeks. This is going to be awesome. The whole team will be there. Sarah watched her brother's excitement with a mixture of concern and envy. At 14, his world was still relatively simple: basketball friends fitting in. He had been too young when their mother died to truly remember her, too young to feel the weight of her absence as Sarah did. And now, by cruel irony, he was eagerly anticipating a party at the home of the man who might be responsible for making them motherless. Mike, she said carefully, what do you know about Mayor Wilson? Michael shrugged, still focused on his basketball. He's Heather's dad, runs the town, used to be a doctor. He glanced at her, suddenly suspicious. Why bother them? Just curious, he's an important man in Riverdale. Yeah, and his daughter's throwing the biggest party of the fall. Michael's attention had already drifted back to his immediate concerns. I need to borrow your blue shirt, the one Mom gave you. The casual reference to their mother stung. Elizabeth Harper had given Sarah that shirt for her birthday just a month before her death. It was too big then. You'll grow into it, her mother had said with a smile. Sarah had treasured it, wearing it only on special occasions. And now Michael wanted to borrow it for a party at the Wilson house. The irony was almost too much to bear. It's in my closet, she said quietly. Just be careful with it. Michael whooped with delight and raced back toward the house, leaving Sarah alone with the rising sun and the weight of secrets she wasn't sure how to carry. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks and distracted thoughts. At school, Sarah moved through the hallways with heightened awareness, noticing details she had previously ignored. The way teachers deferred to Heather Wilson, whose father chaired the school board. The photographs in the main hallway showing Mayor Wilson at various school functions, his practiced smile never reaching his eyes. The newspaper clippings in the trophy case celebrating the Wilson family's contributions to Riverdale High. The man's influence was everywhere, woven into the fabric of the town. How could Sarah possibly stand against someone with such power? During lunch, she sat in her usual isolated spot, picking at a sandwich she had no appetite for. Across the cafeteria, Michael sat with the basketball team, laughing too loudly at a joke someone had made, trying too hard to belong. Sarah was so preoccupied with her thoughts that she didn't notice Heather Wilson approaching until the girl's shadow fell across her table. I hear your brother's coming to my party, Heather said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. She wasn't alone. Brad and Jason flanked her like royal guards, smirking at the confrontation. Sarah looked up, meeting Heather's gaze with a calmness that came from years of practice. Yes, and you're driving him. It wasn't a question. In that piece of junk Chevy your uncle left behind. Laughter rippled from the entourage. Sarah remained silent, her face revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. Heather leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Sarah. Daddy says your family doesn't know when to leave well enough alone. Like mother, like daughter. The words struck like a physical blow. Sarah's hand tightened around her milk carton, crushing it slightly. Heather's eyes widened fractionally at the reaction, the first real emotion she had ever provoked from the normally impassive farm girl. Tell Michael to be there by 4. Heather continued, regaining her composure. And you can drop him off at the gate. No need for you to come in. She sauntered away, her followers in tow, leaving Sarah with milk dripping from her fingers and a cold certainty forming in her chest. Mayor Wilson knew about her visit to the library, knew she was asking questions about her mother, and he was sending a warning through his daughter. The rest of the school day passed in a haze. Sarah attended her classes, took notes, answered when called upon all, while her mind worked through the implications of Heather's words. By the time the final bell rang, she had made a decision. She would drive Michael to the party as promised, but she wouldn't be waiting outside. If Mayor Wilson wanted to intimidate her, he would have to do it face to face. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, cloudless sky, leaves beginning to turn golden on the trees lining Riverdale's streets. Sarah spent the morning doing chores with mechanical efficiency, her mind elsewhere. The key to the safe deposit box seemed to burn against her skin, where she had hidden it taped to her ankle beneath her sock. After lunch, she retreated to her bedroom to prepare for the afternoon. From the back of her closet, she retrieved clothing. She rarely wore a pair of jeans without patches or signs of farm work, a soft sweater in a shade of blue that matched her eyes, and clean sneakers rather than her usual boots. She brushed her hair until it shone, pulling it back in a neat ponytail, secured with a ribbon her mother had given her. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. She didn't look like a fashion plate, but neither did she look like the rough farm girl everyone expected. She looked normal, unmemorable, which was exactly what she wanted. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew her to the window. A cloud of dust marked the progress of a car coming up the long driveway, not her father's truck, but a Jeep Wrangler she recognized immediately. Uncle James. Sarah hurried downstairs and out onto the porch just as the Jeep pulled up in front of the house. James Harper stepped out, looking much as he had when he left 5 years ago, lean, hard, watchful. The scar on his face caught the sunlight as he turned toward the house, his eyes finding Sarah immediately. Little one, he said, his voice a familiar rumble. Not so little anymore. Sarah felt a smile break across her face, the first genuine smile in days. Uncle James. He climbed the porch steps with the fluid grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. Up close, Sarah could see new lines around his eyes, a touch of gray at his temples. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and a leather jacket that had seen better days. Nothing about him suggested a former Navy SEAL except the watchful intensity of his gaze. Your father called, he said by way of explanation. Said you needed to borrow the Chevy. Thought I'd bring it by myself, make sure it's running right. They both knew it was an excuse. William Harper could have checked the car himself. He was more than capable. This was an olive branch, not from William to James, but from William to Sarah. A recognition, perhaps, that she needed her uncle's steadying presence now more than ever. Is Dad here? Sarah asked, looking past James to the fields where her father usually worked on Saturday afternoons. James shook his head. Gone into town for supplies. Said he'd be back by dinner. He studied her face carefully. You look like your mother today. The simple observation nearly undid her. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to reveal weakness even to James. But he saw, he always saw, and his expression softened. Walk with me, he said, gesturing toward the barn. Let's check on that old Chevy. They walked in companionable silence across the yard, dust puffing beneath their feet. The barn door stood open, revealing the interior's familiar gloom. Inside, parked next to her father's tractor, sat Uncle James's 1972 Chevrolet Impala, a massive boat of a car, its black paint still gleaming despite years of disuse. James ran a hand along the hood with something like affection. Your father's been taking good care of her. He keeps it covered, changes the oil, Starts at once a month. James nodded unsurprised. Billy had always was thorough. He popped the hood, checking fluid levels and connections with practiced ease. Sarah watched him work the familiar routine, soothing her jangled nerves. Finally, James closed the hood and turned to face her. So, he said quietly, want to tell me what's really going on? Sarah hesitated. She had carried her secrets alone for so long that sharing them felt dangerous. But if there was anyone she could trust with the truth, it was James. I found something, she began. A letter from Mom hidden in my old chest. She wrote it just before she died. James went very still, his expression unreadable. What did it say? Sarah glanced toward the barn door, ensuring they were alone, then recounted the contents of the letter in a low voice. As she spoke, she watched James's face, searching for surprise, disbelief, any indication that this was news to him. Instead, she saw a grim confirmation. You knew, she said when she finished, the realization dawning. You knew about Wilson, about what Mom discovered. James leaned against the car, suddenly looking older. Not everything, but enough. He sighed heavily. Elizabeth contacted me after she found the evidence against Wilson. She was scared, Sarah. Not for herself, but for you and Michael. She asked me to be ready to come if anything happened to her. But you didn't come until a year later. Pain flashed across James's face. By the time I heard about her death, it was too late. The investigation was closed, ruled a suicide. I tried to get Billy to reopen it to ask questions. That's why he threw me out, not because of the self-defense training. Sarah absorbed this new information, pieces of the puzzle shifting into clearer focus. The training wasn't just about self-defense, was it? You were preparing me, in case they came for me too. James didn't deny it. You were always perceptive, like your mother. He straightened, decision made. Where's the key now? Hidden in my room. I haven't gone to the bank yet. Good, don't. James's voice was firm. Not yet. Not alone. Wilson has eyes everywhere in this town, especially at the bank. He checked his watch. What time is this party? 4 o'clock. Michael's expecting me to drive him there. And you're planning to do more than just drop him off. It wasn't a question. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I need to see inside that house. See Wilson up close. For a moment, she thought James would argue, tell her it was too dangerous. Instead, he nodded slowly. Reconnaissance. Smart. He reached into the car, retrieving a small object from the glove compartment. Take this. He pressed a small canister into her palm. Pepper spray, the kind police officers carried. Just in case, he said quietly. But remember, the best weapon is the one nobody knows you have. Sarah finished reciting one of his earliest lessons. A rare smile creased James's face. You remember. I remember everything you taught me. James nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Good. Now let's make sure you know how to handle this car. It's bigger than anything you have driven before. For the next hour, James guided Sarah through the operation of the Chevy, from its powerful V8 engine to its sometimes sticky transmission. By the time Michael appeared, basketball under his arm and wearing the blue shirt that had once been Sarah's most prized possession, she felt confident in her ability to control the massive vehicle. Uncle James, Michael exclaimed, surprise and delight mingling in his voice. Nobody told me you were coming. James ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. Just dropping off the car. Heard you've got a big party today. Michael preened slightly, standing taller. The whole team will be there. Coach might even stop by. Sounds important. James glanced at Sarah, a silent communication passing between them. Well, you two better get going. Don't want to be late. Sarah retrieved her jacket from the porch, slipping the pepper spray into the pocket where it would be easily accessible. As she returned to the car, she overheard the last of James's conversation with Michael. Keep an eye on your sister, James was saying, his voice serious. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call this number. He pressed a slip of paper into Michael's hand. I'm staying at the Riverdale Inn for a few days. Michael looked confused but nodded, tucking the paper into his pocket. Sure, Uncle James, days. But it's just a pool party. James clapped him on the shoulder. Course it is. Have fun. Sarah slid behind the wheel of the Chevy, adjusting the seat forward to accommodate her shorter height. Michael jumped into the passenger seat, practically vibrating with excitement. This is so cool, he said, running his hands over the leather dashboard. Wait till the guys see us pull up in this. Sarah started the engine, which roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble. As she carefully maneuvered the car down the driveway, she glanced in the rearview mirror. James stood watching them go, his expression unreadable in the afternoon sun. Uncle James seems different, Michael observed as they turned onto the main road. More serious. Sarah kept her eyes on the road. He's always been serious, Mike. You were just too young to notice. Michael shrugged, already distracted by the prospect of the party ahead. He fiddled with the radio until he found a station playing the latest hit from Guns N' Roses, then settled back in his seat, tapping his fingers against his knee in rhythm with the music. Sarah drove carefully, hyper-aware of the powerful machine under her control. The Wilson estate was on the far side of Riverdale, in an area locals called the Heights, a neighborhood of large homes set on sprawling lots home to the town's doctors, lawyers, and business owners. Mayor Wilson's house was the largest, a colonial-style mansion set back from the road behind wrought iron gates. As they approached, Sarah could see cars already lining the circular driveway, gleaming new models that made the Chevy, for all its classic appeal, look out of place. Teenagers in designer clothing milled about on the perfectly manicured lawn, cups in hand, laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. Sarah felt a momentary pang of doubt. She didn't belong here. Never had, never would. The distance between her world and this one seemed suddenly insurmountable. Just drop me at the gate, Michael said, echoing Heather's earlier instruction. I can walk up to the house. Sarah ignored him, guiding the Chevy through the open gates and up the driveway. She found an empty spot near the edge of the property, away from the other vehicles, but with a clear view of the house. Mike, she said as she turned off the engine, be careful today. Michael rolled his eyes, already reaching for the door handle. It's a party, Sarah, not a military operation. I mean it. These aren't your friends, not really. Just watch yourself. Something in her tone must have reached him because he paused, one foot already out the door. You worry too much. But his voice had softened. I'll be fine. Pick me up at 9. Sarah nodded, watching as he jogged toward the house, already calling out to teammates who greeted him with high fives and backslaps. For a moment, he looked like he belonged, just another teenager at a pool party without a care in the world. If only that were true. Sarah waited until Michael disappeared into the house before making her move. She had no intention of sitting in the car for the next 5 hours, nor did she plan to leave as expected. Instead, she locked the Chevy and made her way across the grounds, staying close to the decorative shrubbery that lined the property. The Wilson estate was impressive, 3 acres of perfectly maintained landscape surrounding a house that could have been transplanted from a southern plantation. White columns supported a grand front portico, large windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, and expansive gardens spread out on either side. At the rear of the property, visible from Sarah's position, an Olympic-sized swimming pool glittered blue, surrounded by lounge chairs and tables laden with food and drinks. Music pumped from speakers hidden among the foliage, and teenagers in swimwear lounged around the pool area. Sarah recognized most of them from school, the jocks, the cheerleaders, the children of Riverdale's elite. There was no sign of Mayor Wilson himself, but several adults circulated among the crowd, presumably chaperones. Sarah skirted the main gathering, making her way toward the house. Her goal was simple reconnaissance. Find Mayor Wilson. Observe him. Perhaps find a way into his private study where evidence of his past might be hidden. The back door to the kitchen stood open, servers in black and white uniforms moving in and out with trays of food. Sarah timed her approach carefully, slipping inside during a moment when the kitchen staff were all occupied with a fresh delivery of ice. The kitchen was a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and marble, larger than the entire first floor of the Harper farmhouse. Sarah moved quickly through it, finding herself in a service hallway that led deeper into the house. She walked with purpose, as if she belonged there, remembering another of James's lessons: act with confidence, and most people will assume you have a reason to be where you are. The hallway opened into a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase to the second floor. The walls were adorned with oil paintings and photographs, many showing Mayor Wilson with various dignitaries. Sarah paused before one that showed a younger Wilson in military uniform, standing beside a group of soldiers whose faces were blurred by distance and time. Are you lost? The voice came from behind her, causing Sarah's heart to leap into her throat. She turned slowly, schooling her features into a mask of innocent confusion. A woman in her 40s stood watching her, elegant in a pale blue sundress that likely cost more than 3 months of the Harper Farms mortgage. Wilson, the mayor's wife, and Heather's mother. Sarah had seen her at school functions always perfectly coiffed, always slightly removed from the other mothers. "I was looking for the bathroom," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Mrs. Wilson's eyes narrowed slightly. "The guest facilities are outside by the pool." Her gaze traveled over Sarah, taking in the carefully chosen outfit that still marked her as an outsider in this world of wealth. "You're the Harper girl. Sarah, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, unable to read the expression that crossed Mrs. Wilson's face, something between recognition and unease. "Your brother is outside with the other basketball players." Mrs. Wilson gestured toward the rear of the house. "The party is limited to the pool area and back lawn. The house is off limits to guests." The message was clear. "You don't belong here. Leave." Sarah nodded again, murmuring an apology as she moved toward the door Mrs. Wilson indicated. She could feel the woman's eyes on her back as she walked away, and something told her that Mrs. Wilson would be informing her husband of this encounter very soon. Outside, the party was in full swing. Michael was at the center of a group of boys performing increasingly reckless dives into the deep end of the pool. Sarah found a spot in the shade of a large oak tree, partially hidden, but with a good view of both the pool and the house. She settled in to wait, watching the interactions around her with the detached interest of an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. An hour passed. The afternoon began to wane, shadows lengthening across the manicured lawn. Mayor Wilson had yet to make an appearance, and Sarah was beginning to think he might not show at all. Perhaps he was avoiding her, knowing she might be at the party. She was about to change positions when a ripple of awareness passed through the crowd. Conversations quieted, postures straightened, and heads turned toward the house. Mayor Richard Wilson had emerged onto the back terrace. Sarah's first thought was how ordinary he looked, a man in his 50s, of average height and build, with graying hair and the slight paunch of middle age. He wore casual weekend attire, khaki pants, a polo shirt, loafers. Nothing about his appearance suggested the monster her mother's letter had described. But then he smiled, and Sarah understood. It was a politician's smile, practiced and perfect, never reaching his eyes. Those eyes, cold, calculating, assessing, swept over the gathered teenagers with the detached interest of a farmer evaluating livestock. "Enjoying yourselves," he called, his voice carrying easily across the lawn. A chorus of affirmative responses rose from the crowd. "Excellent, excellent. Carry on then. Just remember the rules: no alcohol, no one in the pool alone, and absolutely no one in the house without an escort." His gaze continued to scan the party until, with a jolt that Sarah felt physically, it landed on her arm. For a moment, their eyes locked, pale blue meeting slate gray across the distance. Recognition flashed in his expression, followed by something darker. Then he smiled again, raised his hand in a genial wave, and turned back toward the house. The encounter lasted mere seconds, but it left Sarah cold, despite the warm afternoon. Mayor Wilson knew exactly who she was, and he was not pleased to see her on his property. The next hour passed in tense observation. Sarah maintained her position, watching as Mayor Wilson circulated among the chaperones, stopping occasionally to speak with groups of teenagers. He was clearly playing the role of benevolent host, the generous public servant, opening his home to the town's youth. But Sarah noticed how he kept his distance from Michael, how his eyes repeatedly drifted to where she sat in the shadows. As the sun began to set, the outdoor lighting came on automatically, casting the pool and grounds in a warm golden glow. The atmosphere of the party shifted, becoming louder, more chaotic. Sarah noticed several of the older boys sneaking drinks from flasks concealed in their jackets, their behavior growing increasingly boisterous. Near the deep end of the pool, she spotted Heather holding court with a group of cheerleaders. They huddled together, whispering and giggling, occasionally glancing toward Michael and his friends. Something about their demeanor set off warning bells in Sarah's mind. She began making her way closer to the pool, moving casually from one shaded spot to another. As she approached, she could hear snatches of conversation. "Thinks he's good enough to hang with us. Teach him a lesson. What about his sister? Watching from the trees like some creep." Heather's voice rose slightly, carrying on the evening air. "Daddy says the Harpers have always been trouble. The mother was crazy, killed herself in their barn." The casual cruelty of the words stopped Sarah in her tracks. She stood frozen as Heather continued. "Apparently she was obsessed with Daddy when he was a doctor, stalked him, made up stories about him. When he rejected her, she couldn't handle it. The lies flowed easily from Heather's lips, each word a deliberate distortion of the truth Sarah had discovered. This was the story the Wilsons had crafted, the narrative that protected the mayor's reputation at the expense of Elizabeth Harper's memory. Sarah's hands curled into fists, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The techniques James had taught her for controlling emotions seemed suddenly inadequate against the tide of rage rising within her. Before she could decide on a course of action, a commotion erupted at the pool's edge. Michael stood surrounded by the basketball team, including Brad and Jason, who had joined the group. They appeared to be encouraging him to perform some kind of stunt, a dive from the highest board. "Come on, Harper," Brad called, his voice carrying across the water. "Show us what farm boys are made of." Michael hesitated at the foot of the ladder, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't think so, guys. I'm not that good a diver." "Thought you wanted to be part of the team," Jason said, his tone carrying a subtle threat. "This is like initiation, man. Everyone does it." Sarah could see the conflict on her brother's face, the desire to belong, warring with his natural caution. She began moving toward the pool, instinct telling her to intervene, but she was too late. Michael, surrendering to the pressure, began climbing the ladder to the high dive. The crowd gathered around the pool, sensing entertainment. Even Heather and her friends moved closer, anticipation on their faces. Sarah quickened her pace but found her path suddenly blocked by Mayor Wilson. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice pleasant, but his eyes cold. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Richard Wilson." He extended his hand. Sarah had no choice but to take it, feeling his grip tighten slightly around her fingers, not enough to hurt, but enough to demonstrate power. "Your brother seems to be making quite an impression." Wilson continued, nodding toward the high dive where Michael now stood, looking down at the water with evident fear. "Brave lad." "He's being pressured," Sarah said, trying to move past him. "I need to stop this." Wilson didn't budge. "Boys will be boys, Miss Harper. It's just a harmless initiation ritual. Surely you don't want to embarrass him by intervening?" The calculation in his eyes told Sarah everything she needed to know. This was deliberate, a distraction to keep her occupied while something happened to Michael. A warning, just like Heather's words had been. "Excuse me," she said firmly, sidestepping the mayor with a quickness that seemed to surprise him. But she had only taken a few steps when a cheer went up from the crowd. Michael had jumped or been pushed, Sarah couldn't tell which. His body hit the water awkwardly with a slap that made several onlookers wince. He surfaced, gasping and sputtering, to the sound of mocking laughter rather than applause. As Michael swam toward the edge, Brad and Jason exchanged glances. Then, with a suddenness that suggested planning, they moved forward and grabbed Michael's arms, preventing him from climbing out. "Not so fast, farm boy," Brad called loudly. "That was pathetic. I think you need swimming lessons." Sarah broke into a run, pushing through the crowd as Jason joined in, dunking Michael's head underwater. Her brother struggled, arms flailing, but the older boys were stronger, holding him down as the seconds stretched. When they finally allowed him to surface, Michael gasped for air, panic evident on his face. "Stop," he choked out. "I can't." But they pushed him under again, the crowd's laughter turning uncertain as the game crossed a line into something more sinister. Sarah reached the pool's edge just as they dunked him a third time. Without hesitation, she kicked off her shoes and dove in, cutting through the water with powerful strokes. She reached the boys in seconds, surfacing between them with enough force to break their hold on Michael. "Get away from him," she ordered, her voice carrying an authority that made both boys blink in surprise. Michael surfaced beside her, coughing and sputtering, his face pale with fear and lack of oxygen. Sarah positioned herself between her brother and his tormentors, treading water easily despite her fully clothed state. "Chill out, farm girl," Jason said, recovering his composure. "We were just messing around." "Yeah," Brad added, "teaching the rookie how to swim." "By drowning him," Sarah's voice was ice. "Touch him again, and you'll regret it." The boys exchanged glances, amusement replacing their momentary surprise. "Oh, yeah." Brad moved closer, his larger body looming over Sarah in the water. "What are you going to do about it?" Sarah was acutely aware of the crowd watching from the pool's edge, of Heather's smirking face, of Mayor Wilson observing from a distance. This was what they wanted, to provoke her, to create a scene, to have an excuse to humiliate both Harpers in one evening. But they had miscalculated badly. As Brad reached for her shoulder, intending to dunk her as they had done to Michael, Sarah moved with the fluid precision James had drilled into her for years. Her hands shot out, grasping Brad's wrist and applying pressure to a nerve point that made him gasp in pain. Simultaneously, she used his own momentum to pull him forward off balance, his face plunging into the water. When he surfaced, spluttering with rage, Sarah was already facing Jason, who had lunged toward her in response to his friend's distress. She sidestepped his grab, using the water's resistance to her advantage, and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus, not hard enough to cause damage, but sufficient to expel the air from his lungs. Both boys retreated, stunned by the unexpected resistance from the quiet farm girl they had always dismissed. "Michael," Sarah said, without taking her eyes off the older boys, "get out of the pool." Her brother didn't argue, swimming quickly to the ladder and pulling himself out. The crowd parted around him, shock evident on their faces. Sarah followed more slowly, keeping herself between the boys and the exit until she reached the pool's edge. As she climbed out, water streaming from her clothes, she became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the party. Every eye was on her, the dripping farm girl who had just taken on two of Riverdale High's star athletes and emerged victorious. Even Heather looked stunned, her perfectly made-up face slack with disbelief. And there, standing at the edge of the crowd, was Mayor Wilson. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah sensed calculation behind his neutral gaze. She had just revealed a card he hadn't known she held, and she could see him reassessing his strategy in real time. "Michael," Sarah said quietly, "we're leaving." Her brother nodded, still coughing slightly, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. He followed her through the crowd, which parted silently before them. As they passed Heather, the girl found her voice. "You're both freaks," she hissed, "just like your crazy mother." Sarah paused, turning to face her tormentor. In that moment, with adrenaline still coursing through her veins and the truth of her mother's fate burning in her chest, she came dangerously close to revealing everything she knew. The words rose to her lips, accusations that would shatter the Wilson family's carefully constructed facade. But wisdom prevailed. This was neither the time nor the place. Not with Michael dripping and vulnerable beside her, not with Mayor Wilson watching from the shadows. Instead, she leaned close to Heather and whispered, "At least my mother had principles. What does yours have besides a husband who tells lies about dead women?" The color drained from Heather's face, her eyes widening in shock. Before she could respond, Sarah turned away, guiding Michael toward the front of the house where the Chevy waited. They were halfway to the car when Sarah heard rapid footsteps behind them. She turned instinctively, pushing Michael behind her to find Mayor Wilson approaching with two of the adult chaperones. "Miss Harper," he called, his voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd. "I think we need to discuss what just happened." Sarah stood her ground. "My brother was assaulted. We're going home." "Those are serious allegations." Wilson's tone was reasonable, concern, the voice of authority. "Perhaps we should call your father, or the police." The threat was subtle but clear. If Sarah pushed the issue of Michael's treatment, Wilson would escalate the situation, turning it against them somehow. "That won't be necessary," she replied evenly. "We just want to leave." Wilson stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Sarah could hear. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Harper. One your mother lost. I'd advise you to reconsider your actions very carefully." The direct confirmation of her suspicions sent ice through Sarah's veins. She met his gaze unflinchingly. "Are you threatening me, Mayor Wilson?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Merely offering advice. Riverdale is a small town with a long memory. Your family has suffered enough tragedy, don't you think?" Before Sarah could respond, a new voice entered the conversation, deep, authoritative, familiar. "Everything all right here?" Uncle James strode across the lawn, his presence immediately altering the dynamic. Though dressed casually, he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing, his scarred face impressive in the gathering darkness. Mayor Wilson's expression flickered briefly before his political mask reasserted itself. "Ah, Mr. Harper, I was just expressing concern about this unfortunate incident. Your niece seems quite protective of her brother." "Family trait," James replied easily, though Sarah could see the tension in his posture. He positioned himself subtly between the Harpers and Wilson. "Sarah, Michael, the car's running. Why don't you two head home? I'll follow in the Jeep." Relief washed over Michael's face, but Sarah hesitated. "Uncle James, it's all right," he assured her, his eyes never leaving Wilson's face. "The mayor and I are overdue for a conversation anyway." Wilson's smile remained fixed, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Indeed we are, Mr. Harper. Perhaps about old times in Panama." The reference to the very operation mentioned in Elizabeth's letter confirmed Sarah's worst fears. These men knew each other, had history that stretched back to the events her mother had uncovered. Go, James said again more firmly. Now. This time Sarah didn't argue. She guided Michael to the Chevy, helping him into the passenger seat, despite his weak protests that he could manage himself. As she slid behind the wheel, she glanced back at the two men still standing on the lawn, James and Wilson locked in conversation, their postures suggesting a confrontation held in check only by the public setting. The Chevy's engine roared to life, and Sarah carefully navigated out of the Wilson estate, conscious of Michael shivering beside her, despite the car's heater. What just happened? He asked, his voice small in the darkness of the car. How did you, where did you learn to fight like that? Sarah kept her eyes on the road. Uncle James taught me, years ago. And what was that about, Mom? What Heather said and then what you said to her? Sarah sighed, knowing she couldn't protect her brother from the truth any longer. It's complicated, Mike, but Mom didn't kill herself. She was murdered, and Mayor Wilson had something to do with it. Michael stared at her, water still dripping from his hair onto the leather seat. That's crazy, Sarah. That's a serious accusation. I know, and I have proof. She glanced at him, seeing in his pale face the last vestiges of childhood innocence about to be shattered. When we get home, I'll show you Mom's letter. You deserve to know the truth. They drove in silence for several miles, the events of the afternoon settling around them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice stronger. What do we do now? Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind racing ahead to the confrontation she knew was coming. We wait for Uncle James, and then we make a plan. Because one thing was now abundantly clear. Mayor Wilson knew they were a threat to him, and he wouldn't stop until that threat was eliminated, just as he had eliminated their mother 10 years before. The quiet farm girl and her secret skills had been revealed. There was no going back now, only forward into a storm that had been brewing for a decade. Night had fallen completely by the time Sarah pulled the Chevy into the Harper Farms driveway. The headlights swept across the weathered barn and silent farmhouse, revealing no sign of their father's truck. The property lay dark and still under a canopy of stars, the familiar landscape transformed into something almost alien in the moonlight. Sarah cut the engine and silence enveloped them. Beside her, Michael sat shivering in his damp clothes, his earlier bravado erased by the events at the Wilson estate. For a moment, neither spoke, processing the seismic shift that had occurred in their lives over the course of a single afternoon. Dad's not home yet, Michael finally observed, his voice small in the darkness. Sarah nodded, feeling a strange relief at the temporary reprieve. William Harper would have questions about their early return, questions she wasn't prepared to answer until she had spoken with Uncle James. Let's get you inside, she said. You need dry clothes. They trudged up to the house in silence, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Sarah unlocked the door and flipped on the kitchen light, the familiar space a comforting contrast to the opulent Wilson mansion. Here at least they knew where they stood, who they were. Go shower and change, she told Michael. I'll make some hot chocolate. He hesitated, looking at her with eyes that suddenly seemed older. You promised to tell me about Mom. I will, but get warm first. We have time before Uncle James gets here. Michael nodded and headed upstairs, his footsteps heavy on the worn wooden treads. Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, going through the familiar motions of heating milk, finding the cocoa powder, adding the touch of cinnamon their mother had always used. The routine tasks helped steady her hands, which had begun to tremble as the adrenaline of confrontation wore off. By the time Michael returned, dressed in sweatpants and a faded Iowa Hawkeye sweatshirt, his hair still damp from the shower, Sarah had mugs of steaming cocoa waiting on the kitchen table. She had changed as well, replacing her own wet clothes with jeans and a flannel shirt that had once belonged to their father. Michael slid into his usual chair, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. So, he said simply. Sarah took a deep breath and reached into her pocket, withdrawing the folded pages of their mother's letter. I found this in my old chest in the barn, she began. It's from Mom, written just before she died. She slid the letter across the table. Michael stared at it as if it might bite, making no move to pick it up. It's her handwriting, Sarah assured him softly. I remember. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he finally reached for the letter. Sarah watched his face as he read, saw the confusion, disbelief, and finally understanding wash over his features. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She didn't kill herself," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "All these years we thought, I know." Sarah reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. "Dad let us believe the official story, maybe to protect us, maybe because he couldn't face the truth himself. And Mayor Wilson, he had her murdered because of something she saw in Panama." Sarah nodded grimly. She was going to expose him. He couldn't let that happen. Michael's expression hardened, a glimpse of the man he would become showing through the boy's features. "So what do we do? Go to the police?" "Sheriff Davis is Wilson's brother-in-law, and most of the deputies coached you in Little League. This town runs on connections, Mike. We can't trust the official channels." "Then what?" "We just let him get away with it." Anger flashed in Michael's eyes. "He killed our mother, Sarah. And tonight those guys, his daughter's friends, they tried to—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the memory of his near drowning still too fresh. Sarah squeezed his hand. "We're not letting anyone get away with anything. But we need to be smart. Mom left evidence in a safe deposit box. Once we have that, we can take it beyond Riverdale to the state police, maybe the FBI." "FBI?" Michael's eyes widened. "This is serious, isn't it? Like really serious?" "Dead serious." The voice came from the doorway, startling them both. Uncle James stood there, his powerful frame silhouetted against the night. He stepped into the kitchen light, and Sarah saw the grim set of his mouth, the tension in his shoulders. Whatever conversation he'd had with Mayor Wilson had clearly been unpleasant. "Uncle James," Michael said, relief evident in his voice. "Did you punch Mayor Wilson? Because after what Sarah told me, I kind of hope you did." A ghost of a smile touched James's scarred face. "Not tonight, kiddo. Too many witnesses." He moved to the stove, pouring himself a mug of the remaining hot chocolate. "Though I did make it clear that any further attempts to intimidate either of you would have serious consequences." He joined them at the table, his large hands dwarfing the mug as he wrapped them around it. "I see Sarah's filled you in," he said, nodding toward the letter still lying open on the table. "Some of it," Michael replied, "but I still don't understand. Why Panama? What did Mom see that was so important?" James exchanged a glance with Sarah before answering. "Your mother was a military nurse assigned to a forward medical unit during Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989. Dr. Wilson, before he was Mayor Wilson, was the chief medical officer of that unit. The invasion to capture Noriega," Michael said, surprising them both with his knowledge. "We studied it in history class." James nodded. The official mission was to protect American citizens, defend the Panama Canal, and restore democracy. But there were other operations happening, behind-the-scenes classified programs that never made the official reports. "Like what?" Sarah asked, sensing they were finally approaching the heart of the mystery that had claimed their mother's life. James took a long sip of his chocolate before answering. "Wilson was running unauthorized drug trials on soldiers suffering from combat stress. Experimental compounds that were supposed to make them more resilient, more aggressive, less affected by the psychological impact of combat. Human experimentation," Sarah said flatly. "That's what Mom discovered." "Yes, and not just any experiments. These drugs had severe side effects. Paranoia, violent outbursts, psychosis. 3 soldiers died under Wilson's care, deaths he attributed to enemy action. Your mother was suspicious, started keeping records. She found Wilson's private logs documented the true nature of his work." "But why would he be doing that?" Michael asked. "What was the point?" "Money," James said simply. "The pharmaceutical company developing these compounds stood to make billions in military contracts if the drugs proved effective. Wilson was on their payroll, a consultant receiving payments through offshore accounts." Sarah's mind raced, connecting dots from her mother's letter to James's revelations. "So when Mom threatened to expose him, he had too much to lose," James confirmed. "Not just his career, but potentially his freedom. Human experimentation without consent violates every medical ethics code in existence, not to mention military law." "So he killed her," Michael said, his voice hollow. "Made it look like suicide." James's expression darkened. "I believe so, yes. Though proving it after 10 years won't be easy. That's why your mother's evidence is so crucial. If she documented everything as thoroughly as I think she did, those records could still bring Wilson down even now." Sarah reached into her sock and carefully extracted the small key she had kept hidden there. This opens a safe deposit box at Riverdale Savings and Loan. Mom said all her evidence is inside. James examined the key, turning it over in his weathered hands. We'll need to retrieve the contents first thing Monday morning when the bank opens. But we need to be careful. Wilson has eyes everywhere in this town. What about Dad? Michael asked suddenly. Does he know about all this? A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. James set down his mug, choosing his words carefully. Your father. William loved your mother more than anything in this world. When she died, something in him broke. I tried to tell him my suspicions about Wilson, but he couldn't bear to hear it. Easier to accept the official story than to face the possibility that he failed to protect her. But now we have proof, Sarah insisted. Mom's letter, her evidence. And we'll share it with him, James assured her. But first we need to secure that evidence. Once we have it, we can decide the best way to proceed. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted their conversation. Headlights swept across the kitchen windows as a vehicle pulled into the driveway. Dad's home, Michael said unnecessarily. James gathered the letter and key, returning them to Sarah. Not a word about any of this tonight, he cautioned. We don't want to put your father in a position where he feels he has to act impulsively. Tomorrow after we have the evidence, we'll tell him everything. Sarah nodded, tucking the items safely away as the familiar sound of their father's boots approached the porch. The door opened and William Harper stepped inside, stopping short at the sight of the three of them gathered around the kitchen table. James, he said, surprise and wariness mingling in his voice. Didn't expect to find you here. Just checking on the kids, James replied easily. They had a bit of trouble at the Wilson party. William's gaze moved to Michael, taking in the boy's subdued demeanor. What kind of trouble? Before either Sarah or James could formulate a response, Michael spoke up. Some of the guys on the team were being jerks. Dunked me in the pool, wouldn't let me up. Sarah stepped in and stopped them. William's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest he typically came to showing surprise. That right, Sarah nodded, offering no elaboration. She knew her father well enough to recognize that he was processing this information, fitting it into his understanding of his children and their place in Riverdale's social hierarchy. Heather Wilson said some nasty things about Mom. Michael continued, his voice gaining strength. Called her crazy. Said she killed herself because she couldn't handle life. A muscle twitched in William's jaw, a tiny tell that spoke volumes about his controlled rage. That's so. I thought you should know, Michael finished, in case Mayor Wilson says something to you. William hung his coat on the hook by the door, his movements precise and controlled. When he turned back to them, his face was a mask of studied neutrality. People talk, always have. Don't much matter what they say. But Sarah could see it did matter tremendously. Whatever William Harper's failings as a communicative parent, he had loved their mother deeply. The suggestion that others were maligning her memory cut him to the quick. I should head back to the inn, James said, rising from the table. Early start tomorrow. William nodded stiffly. You're welcome to the spare room. No sense driving back to town this late. The offer from a man who had ordered James off his property 5 years earlier spoke volumes about the shift occurring in their family dynamic. James recognized it too, because he nodded his acceptance without argument. Appreciate that, Billy. As the adults prepared for bed, Sarah and Michael exchanged glances laden with unspoken understanding. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would change their family forever. For tonight, they maintained the fragile peace of half-truths and careful omissions. But as Sarah climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she felt a curious lightness. The secret she had carried alone for so long was now shared with Michael, with Uncle James, and soon with her father. Whatever came next, they would face it together as a family. In her room, Sarah carefully hid her mother's letter and the key beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. Then she crossed to the window, gazing out at the starlit expanse of the Harper farm. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that echoed across the fields. Tomorrow they would seek justice for Elizabeth Harper. Tonight her daughter kept vigil, standing guard over the truth that had remained buried for far too long. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, the autumn air crisp with promise. Sarah rose early, completing her chores with mechanical efficiency, her mind fixed on the task ahead. By 7:30, all four Harpers were gathered around the kitchen table for a breakfast that no one seemed particularly interested in eating. William had called the school, informing them that Sarah and Michael would be absent due to family matters. He had then called his delivery clients, rescheduling the day's work. These actions, performed without explanation, told Sarah that her father sensed the gravity of the situation even without knowing its full dimensions. "Bank opens at 9, James said, breaking the strained silence. "Sarah and I will go. Billy, you and Michael should stay here." William set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "And why's that?" "Because the fewer people seen accessing that safe deposit box, the better," James replied. "Wilson's already suspicious. If he sees the whole Harper family marching into the bank together, he'll know something's up." "And what exactly is in this box that's got Wilson so concerned?" William asked, his gaze moving between James and Sarah. Sarah took a deep breath. The moment had come sooner than expected. "Evidence," she said quietly. "Evidence that Mom was murdered." The color drained from William's face. For a moment he looked as though he might shatter the cup in his hand. Then with visible effort he set it down and turned to James. "You knew about this." It wasn't a question, but James answered anyway. "I suspected. Elizabeth contacted me before she died, said she had proof of something Wilson was involved in. But she wanted to handle it her way through proper channels. By the time I heard about her death, the investigation was already closed." "And you never thought to mention this to me?" William's voice was dangerously quiet. "I tried Billy. That night in the barn, the real reason I came back a year after she died. I tried to tell you my suspicions, but you didn't want to hear it." William flinched as if struck. "So instead you taught my daughter to fight, prepared her for, what, revenge?" "Protection," James corrected firmly, "in case whoever killed Elizabeth ever came after her children." And now, William looked at Sarah, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time the strength that had been forged in silence over the years. "What's your plan?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Get Mom's evidence. Take it to the state police or FBI. Make Wilson answer for what he did." William was quiet for a long moment, his thoughts unreadable behind his weathered face. Finally, he nodded once decisively. "Then we do it together. All of us." "Dad," Sarah began, but William cut her off with a raised hand. "I've failed your mother once already by not asking the right questions when she died. I won't fail her again." He stood, his decision made. "We all go to the bank, together, as a family." James looked as though he might argue, then thought better of it. "All right, Billy, but we need to be smart about this. In and out, no fuss. Then straight to the state police barracks in Cedar Rapids, away from Wilson's influence." The plan was simple in theory: retrieve the contents of the safe deposit box, leave town immediately, and place the evidence in the hands of authorities beyond Mayor Wilson's reach. But as Sarah observed the grim determination on the faces of her family, she knew that nothing about this day would be simple. They departed in two vehicles, William's truck and James's Jeep, a precaution in case they needed to separate. The drive into town passed in tense silence, each lost in private thoughts about what lay ahead. Riverdale on a Monday morning moved with the slow, predictable rhythm of small-town life. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks in front of their businesses. The post office flag rose in the town square, and a handful of elderly residents gathered at Jenkins' diner for their daily coffee and conversation. The Riverdale Savings and Loan occupied a brick building on Main Street, its architecture a testament to the town's more prosperous past. As the Harpers parked across the street, Sarah noticed a black sedan similar to the one that had followed her from the library days earlier. It was parked half a block away, a single occupant visible behind the wheel. "We've got company," she murmured to James as they exited the vehicles. James followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Wilson's man. He's watching the bank." "Should we abort?" Michael asked, the excitement of the moment causing him to slip into language from the spy movies he loved. "No," William said firmly. "We proceed as planned. James, you and the kids go in first. I'll keep watch out here, make sure nobody follows you." James nodded, understanding the logic. 15 minutes max. If we're not out by then, I'll come in after you," William finished. "Go." Sarah, Michael, and James crossed the street together, ascending the short flight of steps to the bank's entrance. Inside, the space was cool and quiet, the morning's business not yet in full swing. A middle-aged woman behind the counter looked up at their entrance, her professional smile faltering slightly as she recognized them. "Mr. Harper," she greeted James, her eyes darting between him and the teenagers. "How can I help you today?" "Safe deposit access, please," James replied smoothly. "Box 3115. The woman, her nameplate identified her as Mrs. Chambers, consulted a register. I see that box is registered to Elizabeth Harper. I'll need to see some identification and proof of relation. Sarah stepped forward, producing both her mother's key and her own school ID. I'm Sarah Harper, Elizabeth's daughter. This is her box. Mrs. Chambers examined the ID carefully, then consulted her register again. I'm afraid minors cannot access safe deposit boxes without a parent or guardian present. I'm her uncle and legal representative of the Harper family, James interjected smoothly, presenting his own identification. William Harper has authorized this access. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mrs. Chambers' face. I should check with the manager. Is there a problem, Margaret? The voice came from behind them, causing Sarah's spine to stiffen. She turned slowly to find herself face to face with Richard Wilson. The mayor was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his smile as practiced and empty as it had been at the party. But here in the fluorescent lighting of the bank, Sarah could see the coldness in his eyes more clearly. Mayor Wilson, Mrs. Chambers said, relief evident in her voice. These people are trying to access Elizabeth Harper's safe deposit box. I was just explaining our policies regarding minors. Wilson's smile never wavered. I see. Well, as chairman of the bank's board, perhaps I can be of assistance. He turned to James. Mr. Harper, this is quite a coincidence. I was just discussing your family with Sheriff Davis this morning. Is that so? James replied. His voice neutral, but his posture subtly shifting to place himself between Wilson and the teenagers. Indeed, he was quite concerned about reports from my daughter's party, something about an altercation involving your niece and nephew. Wilson's gaze moved to Sarah, assessing and calculating. Physical violence is taken quite seriously in our community, Miss Harper. So is attempted drowning, Sarah responded evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Wilson chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. Teenage horseplay, I'm sure, though the sheriff mentioned the possibility of pressing charges. Such a shame that would be a permanent mark on your record, just as college applications approach. The threat was clear: back off or face consequences. Sarah felt Michael tense beside her, but a warning glance from James kept him silent. We're just here for our mother's belongings, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Nothing more. Of course, Wilson turned to Mrs. Chambers. I believe we can make an exception to policy in this case, Margaret. Family matters are so important, aren't they? Please escort the Harpers to the vault. Mrs. Chambers nodded clearly, relieved to have direction from a superior. Right this way, please. As they followed her toward the back of the bank, Wilson called after them. Mr. Harper, a word before you leave. I believe we have some unfinished business from Saturday night. James paused, glancing at Sarah and Michael. Go ahead, he told them. I'll join you in a moment. Sarah hesitated, reluctant to leave her uncle alone with Wilson, but James gave her a reassuring nod. Go. Get what we came for. Mrs. Chambers led them through a heavy door into the vault area where rows of safe deposit boxes lined the walls. She located box 317 and inserted her key, indicating that Sarah should use her mother's key in the second lock. The box slid out smoothly, revealing a metal container approximately the size of a shoebox. Mrs. Chambers lifted it and carried it to a private viewing room adjacent to the vault. I'll be at my desk if you need anything, she said, closing the door behind her as she left. Sarah and Michael stared at the container for a moment, both suddenly hesitant to open it. This is it, Michael said softly. Mom's evidence. After all these years. Sarah nodded, steeling herself. With careful hands, she lifted the lid. Inside lay several items: a leather-bound journal, a small tape recorder with 3 cassettes labeled with dates, a manila envelope containing what appeared to be medical records, and a sealed letter addressed simply to my children. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the journal. The first page bore her mother's handwriting, neat, precise notes documenting patients' treatments and observations. As she skimmed the entries, the true horror of Wilson's experiments became clear. Soldiers suffering from PTSD were given experimental drugs without consent, their symptoms often worsening dramatically. 3 deaths were recorded in clinical detail, along with Wilson's orders to falsify the cause. This is worse than we thought, Sarah murmured, passing the journal to Michael. He wasn't just testing drugs, he was deliberately ignoring severe reactions, pushing dosages, even when patients showed dangerous side effects. She turned to the tape recorder, pressing play on the first cassette. Their mother's voice filled the small room. a voice neither had heard in 10 years. Michael's eyes widened, and Sarah felt tears threatening as Elizabeth Harper's calm professional tones described a confrontation with Dr. Wilson over his unethical practices. The recording captured Wilson's response. These men signed up to serve their country by any means necessary. The drugs will make them better soldiers, stronger, more resilient. A few side effects are an acceptable trade-off for the advantage these compounds will give our military. Elizabeth's response was clear and firm. Not without informed consent. Not with fatalities you're covering up. This stops now, or I'm taking everything I've documented to the command. Wilson's laugh sent chills down Sarah's spine. And who do you think authorized this program? Nurse Harper. How high up do you think this goes? Take a step back and consider your family. That little girl of yours, Sarah, isn't it? And the boy. They need their mother. The recording ended there, the threat unmistakable. Sarah and Michael exchanged horrified glances. He threatened her, Michael said, his voice tight with rage. Right there on tape. Sarah reached for the letter addressed to them, breaking the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a single page dated the day before their mother died. My beloved children. If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I've tried to protect you both while still doing what is right, but I fear that may not be possible anymore. The evidence I've gathered against Wilson cannot be ignored or suppressed. Tomorrow I'm taking everything to Colonel Marshall Wilson's superior officer who arrived for inspection yesterday. Know that every action I've taken has been with you in my heart. Sarah, my strong, quiet girl, you have a power in you that goes beyond physical strength. Your sense of justice, your unwavering spirit, these are your true gifts. Michael, my sweet boy, your compassion and quick mind will take you far. Never lose your kindness, even in a world that sometimes seems to punish it. If something happens to me, know that I did not choose to leave you. Know that I fought with everything I had to stay with you, to watch you grow, to be the mother you deserve. And know that the truth, however painful, is always worth fighting for. I've arranged for copies of these materials to be held by a trusted friend. If anything suspicious happens to me, these copies will be sent to the proper authorities. This is my insurance policy, my way of protecting you, even if I can't protect myself. Remember that I love you both always and completely. Your loving mother, Elizabeth. Sarah carefully folded the letter, her throat tight with emotion. She was going to report Wilson the day she died. She never made it to Colonel Marshall. We need to get this to the authorities now, Michael said urgently. All of it. Sarah nodded, gathering the materials and returning them to the metal container. Let's find Uncle James. They exited the viewing room to find Mrs. Chambers waiting nervously outside. Did you find what you needed? She asked, her eyes darting toward the front of the bank. Yes, thank you, Sarah replied. We'd like to take these items with us. Of course, if you'll just sign here. She produced a form which Sarah signed quickly. As they walked back toward the bank's main area, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. The conversation between James and Wilson had taken longer than expected, and when they emerged into the lobby, neither man was visible. Where's Uncle James? Michael asked, voicing Sarah's concern. Mrs. Chambers hesitated. The mayor and Mr. Harper stepped outside a few minutes ago. They seemed to be having a rather intense discussion. Sarah clutched the metal container tighter, moving quickly toward the entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see her father and Uncle James standing face to face with Mayor Wilson and Sheriff Davis. Two deputy cruisers had pulled up alongside the black sedan, their lights flashing silently. This isn't good, Michael muttered, as they pushed through the doors onto the steps outside. The tableau before them froze momentarily as all four men turned to look at Sarah and Michael. Sheriff Davis, a heavy-set man with a florid complexion and small, calculating eyes, was the first to speak. Sarah Harper, he said formally, I need you to hand over that container and come with me to the station. There are some serious allegations we need to discuss. James stepped forward. She's a minor, Davis. You can't question her without a parent or lawyer present. I'm her father, William said, his voice like granite, and she's not going anywhere with you. Sheriff Davis sighed theatrically. I was hoping to handle this quietly, but if you insist. He gestured to his deputies, who began approaching the steps. Sarah Harper, you're under arrest for assault and battery against Brad Simmons and Jason Mercer. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is ridiculous, James growled. Those boys were assaulting Michael. Sarah was defending her brother. That's not how the witnesses tell it, Sheriff Davis replied. According to multiple statements, including Ms. Wilson's, Sarah Harper launched an unprovoked attack on two student-athletes, causing injuries requiring medical attention. Mayor Wilson stepped forward, his expression a mask of civic concern. Nobody wants this to escalate, William. Perhaps we could discuss an arrangement? The charges dropped in exchange for whatever is in that container. Sarah's holding, family memorabilia should stay private after all. The naked quid pro quo hung in the air between them. Sarah looked at her father, whose face had gone dangerously still. Sarah, William said quietly, give me the box. She hesitated only a moment before handing the container to her father. William balanced it in his hands as if weighing its contents against the future of his children. You know, he said to Wilson, his voice deceptively conversational, Elizabeth always said you were a coward behind that politician's smile. Said you hid behind rules and regulations while breaking every oath you ever took. Wilson's smile tightened. Your wife was a troubled woman, William. We all grieved when she took her own life. Except she didn't, did she, Richard? William's voice remained calm, but his eyes burned with a fury long suppressed. She was going to expose you. So you silenced her. Made it look like suicide. The color drained from Wilson's face. That's a dangerous accusation, Harper. One that could ruin what's left of your family's reputation in this town. William laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. You think I care about reputation, about what this town thinks? He looked down at the container in his hands. For 10 years, I've lived with the belief that my wife chose to leave us, that she gave up. I built walls around that pain, tried to protect my children from it. But all along, she was murdered. By you. He turned to Sheriff Davis. You want to arrest someone? Arrest him. For the murder of Elizabeth Harper. Sheriff Davis shifted uncomfortably. Now, William, that's a serious allegation without evidence. We have evidence, Sarah interjected, stepping forward. Mom's journal, recordings, documentation of Wilson's illegal experiments in Panama. His threats against her. It's all there. She pointed to the container in her father's hands. A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation and the presence of police vehicles. Among them, Sarah recognized faces from throughout Riverdale: shopkeepers, teachers, farmers. And at the edge of the crowd, Heather Wilson watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Mayor Wilson's practiced composure began to crack. This is absurd. Ancient history being twisted by a family that never accepted the truth about their mentally unstable mother. Let's hear the tapes, James suggested loudly, his voice carrying to the gathering crowd. Let everyone hear you threaten Elizabeth Harper for discovering your illegal drug experiments on American soldiers. Wilson's face contorted with rage. Give me that box, Harper, he demanded, lunging toward William. What happened next unfolded with the surreal clarity of moments that changed lives forever. Wilson's hand emerged from his jacket pocket holding a small pistol, a derringer easily concealed but deadly at close range. The crowd gasped collectively as he aimed it at William. The box, Wilson repeated, his politician's mask completely gone. Now. Sheriff Davis reached for his own weapon, but froze at Wilson's warning glance. The deputies looked uncertain, hands hovering near their holsters. Dad, Sarah said quietly, calculating distances and angles as James had taught her. She could disarm Wilson. She knew the technique, but not without risk to her father, who stood directly in the line of fire. William didn't flinch. You've already taken my wife from me, Richard. You won't take the truth too. Wilson's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance. In the moment before chaos erupted, a new voice cut through the tension. Daddy, stop. Heather Wilson pushed through the crowd, her face pale with shock. What are you doing? The momentary distraction was all James needed. He moved with the fluid speed that belied his years, covering the distance between himself and Wilson in 2 strides. A precise strike to Wilson's wrist sent the small pistol clattering to the pavement, and a second blow drove the mayor to his knees. Sheriff Davis finally drew his weapon, but found himself facing not only James but William as well, who had handed the metal container to Sarah and stepped forward to stand beside his cousin. Think carefully, Davis, William advised. Do you really want to be on the wrong side of this? Once those tapes are public, anyone who helped cover for Wilson goes down too. The sheriff's gaze moved from the Harpers to the growing crowd of townspeople, many of whom were recording the confrontation on cameras and camcorders. His political calculus was evident in his expression. Wilson was now a liability, not an asset. Mayor Wilson, Davis said, formally holstering his weapon. I think you better come down to the station to discuss these allegations. Wilson looked up from his kneeling position, his face a mask of disbelief. You can't be serious. I made you sheriff. And I've got an election next year, Davis replied pragmatically. Deputies take the mayor into custody. We'll sort this out at the station. As the deputies handcuffed Wilson, who continued to protest his innocence, Sarah felt a presence beside her. Heather Wilson stood there, her perfect makeup streaked with tears. Did he really kill your mother? She asked, her voice small and lost. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Yes, we have proof. Heather closed her eyes briefly. I knew something was wrong. The nightmares, the locked study, I wasn't allowed to enter the phone calls that would make him leave in the middle of the night. She looked at Sarah with genuine remorse. I'm sorry for what I said about your mother, for everything. Before Sarah could respond, William approached, placing a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders. We need to get that evidence to the state police, he said, right now while Wilson's in custody. I'll drive, James offered. My Jeep's faster than your truck if anyone tries to follow. Sarah looked around at the gathered crowd, at the deputies leading Mayor Wilson to a cruiser, at Heather standing abandoned and confused on the sidewalk. In the space of 20 minutes, the power dynamic of Riverdale had been completely upended. What about school? Michael asked with a hint of his old humor. We're supposed to be absent for family matters. A rare smile crossed William's face as he looked at his children. I'd say this qualifies, wouldn't you? Together, the Harper family walked to James's Jeep, the metal container, with Elizabeth's evidence clutched securely in Sarah's hands. As they drove out of Riverdale toward the state police barracks in Cedar Rapids, Sarah watched the town recede in the side mirror. For 10 years, she had been the quiet farm girl, invisible and overlooked. Today, she had helped bring truth to light and justice to her mother's memory. The secret skills James had taught her, the strength she had cultivated in silence, had served their purpose. Elizabeth Harper would finally have her voice heard, and her daughter, no longer silent, would make sure the whole world listened. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the edge of the Wilson Estates property, watching as workers removed the for sale sign from the front lawn. The grand house had finally sold after months on the market, the Wilson name now tainted beyond redemption in Riverdale. Richard Wilson awaited trial on multiple charges: second-degree murder, conspiracy, medical malpractice, falsification of military records, and fraud. The evidence Elizabeth Harper had gathered proved devastating, especially when combined with testimony from surviving soldiers who had been subjected to his experiments. Wilson's pharmaceutical partners had quickly disavowed any knowledge of his actions, triggering further investigations that reached into the highest levels of military procurement. Riverdale itself had changed in subtle but significant ways. Sheriff Davis had resigned rather than face questions about his role in suppressing the investigation into Elizabeth's death. The bank board had undergone a complete reorganization. And at Riverdale High, a new anti-bullying policy had been implemented, largely at the insistence of Heather Wilson, who had emerged from her father's disgrace with a newfound sense of purpose. As for the Harpers, they too had transformed. William had emerged from his decade of stoic grief, becoming more present and engaged with his children. Michael had found real friends on the basketball team, his natural talents flourishing now that he no longer felt the pressure to be someone he wasn't. And James had moved back to Riverdale, permanently converting the old hunting cabin into a proper home where he taught self-defense classes to women and children from throughout the county. Sarah herself had changed perhaps the most, though, in less visible ways. The quiet farm girl remained somewhat reserved but no longer invisible. She walked the halls of Riverdale High with a new confidence, her silence now a choice rather than a defense mechanism. The martial arts skills she had hidden for so long were now openly acknowledged. She assisted in Uncle James's classes twice a week, helping others find the strength she had discovered within herself. As she turned away from the Wilson estate, Sarah caught sight of a familiar figure waiting by the roadside: Heather, her red hair caught in the spring breeze. I thought I'd find you here, Heather said as Sarah approached. Saying goodbye. Sarah considered this. Not goodbye, just acknowledging an ending. The two girls fell into step together, an unlikely friendship that had emerged from the wreckage of their family's collision. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the town pool, closed until summer, but visible through the chain-link fence. This is where it all came to a head, Heather observed. Where you showed everyone who you really are. Sarah gazed at the still covered pool, remembering the moment she had chosen to reveal her hidden strength. Not all of who I am, she corrected. Just a part I'd kept hidden. Well, I'm glad you didn't keep it hidden that day. Heather's voice softened. You saved your brother, and maybe you saved me too in a different way. They continued walking, passing the school, the diner, the library where Sarah had first begun unraveling the mystery of her mother's death. Riverdale looked the same on the surface, the same buildings, the same streets, the same rhythm of small-town life. But beneath that familiar exterior, everything had changed. As they reached the edge of town where the road stretched toward the Harper farm, Sarah paused. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found my mother's letter, she asked. If we'd all just continued the way we were. Heather considered this. My father would still be mayor. Your mother's murder would still be called a suicide. I'd probably still be the mean girl making your life miserable. She shook her head. Some secrets need to be brought into the light no matter how painful. Sarah nodded, thinking of her mother's words in that final letter. The truth, however painful, is always worth fighting for. See you at school tomorrow, Heather asked as they prepared to part ways. I'll be there, Sarah replied, no longer silent. As she walked the familiar road toward home, Sarah felt the weight of her mother's legacy, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. Elizabeth Harper had stood for truth against powerful forces that sought to silence her. In the end, her voice had been heard, her courage vindicated, her family restored. And her daughter, once known only as the quiet farm girl, had become the silent defender who brought justice at last.